Did it do it?
I believe we are on. Yeah.
In Zoom, it used to say, yeah, anyway. All right. Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. Martin Heidegger's lecture course on Friedrich Hölderlin's Germania and der Rhein, delivered at Freiburg during the winter semester of 1934-35, marks Heidegger's first sustained engagement with the Schwabian poet. Heidegger would later teach a course on the Andenken in 1941-42, and later in 42, he delivered a lecture course on Der Ister. In April 1936, he delivered a lecture on Hölderlin and the Essence of Poetry in Rome, which was published later that year. Interestingly, in a letter to his brother Fritz in March 1937, Heidegger says, while the first edition was sold out before it was even published, the editors of the student magazines were sending their review copies back, as, he says, they want nothing to do with them. He published a collection of essays titled Erläuterungen zu Hölderlins Dichtung in 1944, which was later expanded to include essays written up to 1968. Indeed, after the lecture course of 34-35, the one before us today, it's difficult to find a work of Heidegger's over which the shadow of Hölderlin doesn't loom, and yet prior to this lecture course, Hölderlin's name is hardly mentioned at all. In the forewords, the first edition of his Freueschriften, written in 1972, Heidegger reveals that he discovered Hölderlin through an early edition of his poetry in 1908 when he was 19. This was corroborated 20 years earlier in 1952, when he mentioned this encounter with Hölderlin as part of the exciting and decisive years of his life between 1907 and 1914, which also included his discovery of the Aristotelian question of Tito on through Brentano, the publication of the complete edition of Nietzsche's Will to Power, and further engagements with the works of Hegel, Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Rilke. So clearly, later in his life, Heidegger looked back on this first encounter with Hölderlin as one that held a great deal of significance, though it's not at all clear just how much the poet figured in the development of Heidegger's philosophical thinking until the mid-1930s, if at all. One important mention of Hölderlin prior to 1934 is in relation to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, the subject of Heidegger's lecture course in 1931-32, when he made the point that Hegel's system of philosophy was worked out through an engagement with and confrontation with Hellenism, the possibility of which Heidegger attributes to Hegel's friendship and close proximity to Hölderlin. And so the real question that I want to address in my introduction today, as we prepare to embark on this long expedition through Heidegger's first major engagement with Hölderlin in 1934, is why now? Like Parmenides and Anaximander in 1932 and Heraclitus from 1935, what is decisive for Heidegger in 1934 that brings Hölderlin to the forefront of his thinking? I want to begin answering this question by addressing the question that Heidegger himself posed in a lecture in Constance on November 30th, 1934, midway through the lecture course on Hölderlin. The lecture is called The Present Situation and the Future Task of German Philosophy, wherein Heidegger asks the fundamental question, Wer sind wir? Who are we? Heidegger says, Die Weltzeit, the world time of our people, is hidden from us, and it will remain hidden as long as we do not know who we ourselves are. And we will never know this as long as we do not really ask this question. But if we ask this question, who are we? Then we set our Dasein, our existence, in motion by virtue of which we may be able to enter the realm of philosophy, i.e. into that essential question about the essence of being, dem Wesen des Seins. We are, the Sind here is italicized, as Hölderlin says, ein Gespräch, a conversation. The essence of language is never more clear here in Heidegger's writing than it is right now in these passages when he says next, Die Sprache, language, is not just one of the abilities that humans also have alongside eyes, ears, understanding, and will. Rather, the original essence of their being is language. It is not humans that have language, rather the other way around. Language has humans, i.e. humans are, only as they are, i.e. exposed in the midst of revealed Seienden, the presently present, I suppose. On the ground of language, dem Grunde der Sprache. It won't surprise us in the slightest to learn that the question, Wer sind wir? Who are we? Occupies a prominent place in Heidegger's 1934-35 lectures on Hölderlin, the subject of section 6, in fact, so we'll be working through that in a few weeks' time. In fact, I'd suggest that this very question is at work all the way through the text. It is the very ground of the text itself, and the very reason that Heidegger turns to Hölderlin and to the problem of the ground of language at this particular moment in 1934, when the question of the destiny of Germany is being posed not just in philosophy departments across the country, but elsewhere in the most radical and catastrophic ways. Thus, the timing of Heidegger's turn to Hölderlin immediately after stepping down from his position as rector has not been lost on anybody. For Heidegger, the destiny of Germany, wrapped up in the question of wer sind wir and the ground of language, opens up the pathway back, or perhaps forward, toward Hölderlin. At the beginning of these lectures, in the Vorbemerkung, the preliminary remark, Heidegger writes, a silence must be maintained around him, Hölderlin, for a long time to come, especially now when interest in him is thriving and literary history is seeking new themes. People write now about Hölderlin and his gods. That is surely the most extreme misinterpretation whereby this poet, who still lies ahead of the Germans, is conclusively stifled and made ineffectual under the illusion of now finally doing justice to him. As if his work needed such a thing, especially on the part of the bad judges running around today. One treats Hölderlin historiographically and fails to recognize the singular essential point that his work, still without time or space, has already surpassed our historiographical rummagings and has grounded the commencement of another history. That history starts with the struggle over the decision concerning the arrival or flight of the god. End quote. That Hölderlin still lies ahead of the Germans rather than behind them is for Heidegger a fundamentally historical problem. He says here that Hölderlin is treated only historiographically, that is, as a late 18th, early 19th century poet who has been misunderstood until today, when finally his work is given the respect and time that it deserves. Heidegger intends rather to think through Hölderlin historically as the grounding of the commencement of another history. I presume here, in some sense, he's talking about this other inception, which comes to prominence in his thinking at this time. But there is also this sense of historical reflection, which a few years later in 1938, he would differentiate from historiographical consideration. Whereas the latter points to a kind of cognition, reflection, Besinnung, is looking for the meaning, the Sinn of a happening, the meaning of history. The happening and the happenings of history are primordially and always the future, that which in a concealed way comes towards us, a revelatory process that puts us at risk and thus is compelling in advance. The future is the beginning of all happening. Everything is enclosed within the beginning. So this is how Heidegger is trying to think through Hölderlin and how we ourselves must attend to the text in front of us. Now, for the sake of this introduction, I'm going to rebel against Heidegger's suggestion that historiographical consideration serves only to impede an understanding of the historical and provide some context to the question of why now for Heidegger's turn to Hölderlin, because I want to better contextualize his misgivings about Hölderlin's newfound fame and its significance for Germany at this crucial period in history. Let us begin then with an excursus on the poet himself. While in Tübingen, where Hölderlin began his studies in 1788 at the age of 18, and where, of course, he famously roomed with Hegel and Schelling. Hegel entered the Stift at the same time as Hölderlin. Schelling arrived in 1790, only 16 years old. Hölderlin was trained in the classical tradition by Philipp Konz, who was himself heavily influenced by Johann Winckelmann and Christian Heym. Winckelmann, of course, is widely acknowledged to be the founder of German neoclassicism, which arguably began with his provocation in 1755 that, quote, the only way for us to become great, indeed, if it is possible, inimitable, is through the imitation of the ancients, end quote. Winckelmann exercised a considerable influence over the direction of classical studies at Göttingen, where theology and philosophy took a back seat and historical and literary disciplines predominated. It was here that Gesner made the first attempt to unify the divergent branches of classical studies for the purpose of conceptualizing ancient culture as a distinct system. Gesner's successor, Heyn, a strong advocate of Winckelmann's classicism, took the next crucial step forward and opened the door for a new hermeneutical tradition of classical philology, grounded in Winckelmann's aesthetics and Ernesti's use of linguistics for factual interpretation. It's also worth mentioning here that Winckelmann strongly influenced the direction of the philosophy of history in Germany, especially through Justus Moser and the early development of German historicism. Given Heidegger's remarks about the poverty of historical thinking in modernity, it won't come as a shock that Winckelmann is not looked upon admirably by Heidegger. Hölderlin, on the other hand, emerged out of this tradition through the engagement with Kant, and in fact his master's thesis, written in 1790, called The History of Fine Art Among the Greeks, was steeped in Winckelmann's thesis regarding the imitation of the Greeks. However, by 1799, Hölderlin stood firmly against this tradition. In an essay titled The Perspective from Which We Must Look at Antiquity, Hölderlin bemoans modernity's dream of a culture, Bildung, grounded in originality and independence, of saying nothing but new things, which he attributes to a kind of mild revenge against the slavery with which we have been constrained by antiquity. I'll quote this at length. He says, there seems to be hardly any other choice open to us, to be crushed by what is accepted and positive, or with violent arrogance, to oppose everything learned, available, positive as a living force. And what was the general reason for the downfall of all peoples? Namely, that their originality, their own living nature, succumbed to the positive forms under the luxury which their fathers had brought forth. This also seems to be our fate, and their Schicksal, only in greater measure, since an almost limitless past world, which we become aware of either through instruction or through experience, acts and presses upon us. End quote. Hölderlin's resolution to this apparent ultimatum between slavery to the tradition or through violent arrogance, absolute hostility to the tradition, is fundamentally historical and asks precisely the question that grounds Heidegger's turn to the poet in 1934, Wer sind wir? This is nowhere more apparent than in Hölderlin's two letters written to his friend Boulendorf in 1801, composed either side of his long journey to and from Bordeaux. The original idea was to leave Germany permanently. As he wrote in his first letter to Boulendorf in December 1801, I am now full of parting. I have not wept in so long, yet it has cost me bitter tears, resolving now to leave my fatherland, perhaps forever. For what do I have more precious than the world? But they have no use for me. Similarly, in a letter written to his brother, I think the exact same month, I think December 1801, Hölderlin laments that he was never firmly rooted in his fatherland. It's worth noting here that Hölderlin spoke of the anxieties and which eventually led to his madness as early as 1795, when he was living in Jena, surrounded, he said, by truly great minds, and the proximity of truly great, spontaneous and courageous hearts alternately disheartens and inspires me. I must pull myself out of my gloom and slumber. Increasingly, Hölderlin felt himself slipping away through the pain of loneliness and the fear of being misunderstood. And so by December 1801, he resolved to leave Germany for good. And yet 4 months later, at the beginning of May 1802, he had returned to the fatherland. In the second letter to Boulendorf, written a year after the first one in December 1802, Hölderlin spoke of this transformational sojourn in Bordeaux and the surrounding areas. He says, my dear friend, I have not written you for a long time. I have been in France in the meantime and seen the sad, solitary earth. I have seen the cottages of southern France and the individual beauties, men and women, who grew up amid the anxiety of patriotic doubt and hunger. The powerful element, the fire of the heavens and the reticence of the people, their life in nature and their restrictedness and contentment continually captivated me. And as one says of heroes, I can indeed say that Apollo has struck me. Now, a great deal of discussion has taken place regarding these two letters, and the generally accepted conclusion is that Hölderlin's experiences in France, whatever they were, informed or perhaps even reinforced his understanding of the Greece of antiquity and the grounding concern of modernity, in contrast to ancient Greece, which is the flight of the gods. As he writes in the second letter, the athletic quality of southerly humanity, seen in the ruins of the spirit of antiquity, made me more familiar with the authentic essence of the Greeks. I came to know their nature and their wisdom, their bodies, the way they grew up in their climate, and the rule by which they protected their exuberant genius from the power of the elements. That is what constituted their sociability, the way they adapted themselves to foreign natures and communicated with them. That is why they have their peculiar individuality, which seems so full of life, inasmuch as supreme understanding in the Greek sense is a force of reflection. Hölderlin's reference to the foreign here, das Fremde, echoes the passage of his previous letter, which have attracted a great deal of attention, especially from Heidegger in these lectures, these 1934-35 lectures, and in his lectures from the early 1940s. In the first letter, Hölderlin said to Boulendorf, and I'll quote this one at length because it's quite significant. He says, it sounds paradoxical. The real national, das eigentliche National, will always be the lesser advantage in the progress of culture. For this reason, the Greeks are less masters of sacred pathos, because it was innate to them, but they excel in the gift of representation. From Homer onwards, because this extraordinary man was soulful enough to exploit the Western Germanic sobriety for his Apollonian empire, and thus truly appropriate the foreign, das Fremde sich anzueignen. With us, he says, it's the other way around. That is why it is so dangerous to abstract the rules of art solely and exclusively from Greek excellence. He must have Winckelmann in mind here. I have labored on this for a long time and know now that apart from what must be the highest with the Greeks and us, namely the living relationship and skill, we must not have anything in common with them. But our own must be learned as well as the foreign. That is why the Greeks are indispensable to us. But we will not be able to keep up with them in our national, because, as I said, the free use of our own is the most difficult. For Hölderlin, then, his time spent in France, away from his native Germany, granted to him what he conceived as the possibility to appropriate the foreign, which became the ground for his interpretations and translations of the Greeks. Unsurprisingly, Hölderlin's radical new insight into the Greeks of antiquity and his turning away from the standards of Altertumswissenschaft, of German classical philology, this term would be coined by Friedrich Wolff in 1807, was not well received by his peers. Following the release of his translation of Sophocles' Antigone in 1804, Heinrich Voss Jr., the son of the great translator of Homer, wrote a letter to a friend asking, "What do you say to Hölderlin's Sophocles? Is the man mad, or is he just pretending? Is his Sophocles a hidden satire on bad translators?" The other evening, when I was sitting with Schiller at Goethe's, both of them were quite amused with it. Read the fourth chorus of Antigone. You should have seen Schiller laughing. While in Jena between 1794 and 1795, Hölderlin maintained a good friendship with Schiller, who took a strong interest in the young poet, which makes the scene of mockery 9 years later even more alarming. Even his friends Hegel and Schelling were worried about Hölderlin's health after reading his translation. In a letter to Hegel, Schelling wrote that the poverty of Hölderlin's translation of Sophocles' Antigone must be attributed, he says, to his degenerating mental state. Such was Hölderlin's deteriorating health that barely 2 years later he would be consigned to a tower in Tübingen overlooking the Neckar, referring to himself as Scardanelli while he composed fragmentary poems until his death in 1843. Throughout the 19th century, Hölderlin's poetry, his translations and essays were almost entirely neglected. In 1861, Friedrich Nietzsche, then only 17 years old, composed for a school project, the Schulpforte, a letter addressed an meinen Freund, for whom the young philologist recommended his Lieblingsdichter, his favorite poet, an obscure poet by the name of Friedrich Hölderlin. Herr Koberstein, his teacher, awarded the letter a B- and encouraged Nietzsche to study a healthier and more German, Deutscheren, poet. Later, Hölderlin's novel Hyperion would exert a great influence over the development of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. In 1867, Wilhelm Dilthey, writing under the pseudonym Wilhelm Hoffner, published an essay on Hölderlin, which was later reworked for his Das Erlebnis und die Dichter in 1906. It was in this later work that Dilthey commented on the similarity between Hölderlin and Nietzsche. He wrote, "When Hölderlin's mental sensitivity collided with the adversity of his circumstances, he suffered the same fate that Nietzsche would subsequently. Thus nature had destined these writers and poets to feel the dark shadows of life more intensely and to depict them more violently than had been done before. It is not that they spoke of imaginary evils or sufferings that they did not feel, as vulgar optimism might suppose. Instead, they apportioned light and shadow differently than people with a life-embracing nature, and each of them did so in a way peculiar to him." Another of Hölderlin's admirers later that century was Stefan Georg, whose 1897 volume Das Jahr des Ziel was named after an elegy by Hölderlin. As the Georg circle grew, Hölderlin occupied a prominent place in its discussions. One of Georg's closest friends, Norbert von Hellengrath, was inspired by the publication of Georg's Des Siebente Ring in 1908 to track down, collate, and publish the entire works of Hölderlin. In 1910, he discovered the translations of Pindar and Stuttgart, and in 1912, he began to piece together a 6-volume Sämtliche Werke. In 1915, a year before he was killed in action at Verdun, von Hellengrath delivered 2 lectures on Hölderlin, which were posthumously published in 1922. In the lecture titled Hölderlin und die Deutschen, von Hellengrath calls Germans Hölderlin's Volk, because it is deeply, he says, in the German character that its innermost glow, far beneath its surface, only comes to light in einen geheimen Deutschland, a secret Germany. In contrast to Nietzsche's teacher, Herr Koberstein, his recommendation that Nietzsche study a healthier, more German poet, von Hellegrat calls Hölderlin die deutschesten Dichter, the most German poet. Another member of the Georg Circle, Friedrich Gundolf, writing in 1911, recognized the growing reputation that Hölderlin when he wrote that for the educated people, Hölderlin signifies the romantic poet of the Greeks, who, as the victim of a longing for an irretrievable past, artfully sang his noble soul into madness and death with ancient meters. Until the First World War, this audience remained minuscule. According to one statistic, by 1870, only around 7,000 volumes of Hölderlin's works had been circulated. By contrast, 80,000 copies of his work were sold alone in 1921. Indeed, as Heidegger recalls in his 57-58 lectures on the nature of language, von Hellengrat's publication of Hölderlin's Pindar translations in 1910 and of the late hymns in 1914 hit us students like an earthquake. By 1938, though, he's sick of it. As he writes then, the pursuit of the popularizing of Nietzsche and Burckhardt, and also Hölderlin, is now increasing to unbearable proportions. It's worth noting here that these three figures, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and Burckhardt, represent what we might call the anti-classical tradition in the 19th century. We've already seen how Hölderlin's Greek translations were ridiculed by his contemporaries, and how he himself began to position himself away from the Winckelmann-Goethe neoclassical humanist tradition. As for Nietzsche and Burckhardt, their writings on the Greeks fell foul of one particular classical scholar who was instrumental in the 19th century in consolidating the various schools of classic thought into a unified philological science. That, of course, was Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Mühlendorf, the great student of Theodor Mommsen. The spat between Nietzsche and Wilamowitz is well known, and something I covered in my introduction to the GA55 Heraclitus reading a couple of years ago. Wilamowitz, though, was equally hostile to Burckhardt, whose work, he said in 1899, ignores what the science of antiquity has gained in the last 50 years in the way of sources, facts, methods, and viewpoints. Burckhardt's Greece did not exist. Burckhardt, a student of August Burke no less, was himself disdainful of classical philology, as he signified in a letter he wrote in 1843, the same year he finished his studies in Berlin. He said, philology demonstrates its own spiritual bankruptcy more and more by not having yet produced a good representation of antiquity. Neither is just there for study, horrible for reading. There exists nothing yet about Greece. We will yet experience the triumph when the first readable ancient history will see the light of day without the help of the philologists. Philology now is only a second-rate science, regardless of the great airs that it gives itself. That these three thinkers then, Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and Burckhardt, were becoming increasingly prominent in Germany during the 1920s and 30s is very interesting. It was Wilamowitz himself who, in 1921, proudly declared, "We have at last passed the farther limit of the 19th century, in which the conquest of the ancient world by science was completed." For Wilamowitz, the potential of Altertumswissenschaft, the unity of classical studies initiated by Winckelmann, Gesner, Heine, and Wolff, among others, in the 18th century, had finally been fulfilled. In the same year, Ernst Troeltsch gravely declared a crisis of historicism, wherein the word historismus had become a dirty word, a discharge of all kinds of complaints against historical burdens, complicated historical thinking and historical education that weakens the power of reasoning. For Troeltsch, the events of the First World War had eroded the fundamental historicist notion of an intellectual progress, which he says had produced a suffering humanity. Indeed, while Wilamowitz's consolidation of classical philology produced a fine generation of philologists, including Hermann Diels, Eduard Meyer, and Eduard Schwartz, a new breed of classical philologists emerged out of the wreckage of the First World War. Werner Jaeger, who was Wilamowitz's successor at Berlin in 1930, I think, Karl Reinhardt, Julius Stenzel, Wolfgang Schäderböck, Kurt Rietzler, Bruno Snell, among others, radicalized the scope of Altertumswissenschaft toward a new and original relationship with antiquity. As reported by Otto Pergler after the 1929 conference in Davos, Heidegger made his departure from every merely academic philosophy, and it was at this time that he became more and more engaged with these philologists. Indeed, in his 1929-30 lectures on the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, Heidegger remarks that the foundations of philology are beginning to crumble. He says we can see a process of transformation as philology is being transferred onto new foundations. Heidegger's emerging engagement with the philologists of his day coincided with his new and profound insights into the early Greek thinkers, particularly in Anaximander and Parmenides in 1932, while the significance of Heraclitus became clear to him a few years later. Another important figure around this time was Alfred Bäumler, who, like Heidegger, recognized the important new foundations being laid by the classical philologists. In a 1965 article, Looking Back, he wrote that the new direction which these philologists later forged after Spengler showed us the origins of philosophical thinking among the Greeks in a new light. As Frank Adler surmised in a series of articles he wrote on Heidegger and Bäumler, we're still waiting for the rest of them, by the way, Frank. What caught Heidegger's attention in Bäumler was his claim that both Hölderlin and Nietzsche represent attempts in the German tradition to liberate Greek antiquity from the domination of Roman and Christian interpretations. Bäumler, in his introduction to the 1930 edition of Nietzsche's works, himself identified a profoundly significant relationship between Nietzsche and Hölderlin, who were both marked by a sense of alienation they felt in relation to the modern world. Heidegger and Bäumler struck up a relationship in 1928 when Heidegger had recommended Bäumler for his now vacant chair at Marburg, but by the early 1930s, Heidegger had the impression that Bäumler had become prickly towards him. By 1932, Bäumler was directly criticizing Heidegger's philosophy in a number of talks. On April 30th, 1933, Bäumler joined the Nazi Party, and one day later, on May 1st, so did Heidegger. While Heidegger resigned as rector less than a year later, back from Syracuse, so to speak, Bäumler remained with the party until 1945, and in 1939, he was, along with Ernst Krieg, considered one of the two leading philosophers of National Socialism. The idea of a secret Germany alluded to by von Hölderlin was taken up by Bäumler, who wrote in 1934, the breaking out of the First World War already signifies simultaneously the breaking in, the dawning, Anbruch, of a new era, a strengthening of standards, a heightening of the consciousness of destiny. As Frank Adler remarks in his excellent analysis of Bäumler's engagement with Hölderlin, the Hölderlin that Bäumler appropriates via Hellengrat's death is significantly different from Hellengrat's own interpretation of the poet. Through Hölderlin, Bäumler takes the idea of a secret Germany quite literally in his philosophy of language when he draws a distinction between symbols and words. As he writes in 1934, the word is used in discussion. It indicates itself and the object. The symbol is of a different sort. The symbol is silent. Its understanding follows immediately. No interpretation will help where the primitive primary comprehension of it is lacking. The understanding is unable to grasp it. Only the heart finds a way. For that reason, however, the symbol is not something unspiritual. This builds on what he had articulated in the 1929 work, in his work on Backhoff and Nietzsche, when he argued that man's inner reality cannot be unlocked and elucidated from what he says and thinks. What a man knows is not the same as his inner deepest reality. Only in what people themselves cannot express, in what is done and protected without word, without reflection in worship and custom, does the depth of reality disclose itself. The only one who can interpret the living sense of life is the one who understands the language of silent symbols into which life flows. For Bäumler, though, language was ultimately not the foundation upon which a new Germany could be built in Hölderlin's image, but the heroic enthusiasm that he sees as characterizing Hölderlin's poetry. Bäumler saw the need for a new educational system wherein young German students were molded in the shape of Greek members of the polis, which he says serves as an example to illustrate that freedom only thrives there, where unity consists in symbols. In 1934, as his time as rector draws to a close, Heidegger too mentions, as far as I can tell for the first time, von Hellengrat's notion of a secret Germany in connection to what he perceives as the fundamental need for regrounding the German universities. He writes, and this is quite a long quote, he says, simply reacting with the National Socialist means of power and the associated functionaries can perhaps feign the assertion of a position of power to the outside world. What is the point of this when the whole structure is powerless in itself and, moreover, the supply of new young people or even the retention of pliable teachers is denied to it? The timing of my involvement was too early, or better, it was completely superfluous. The contemporary leadership should not aim at internal change in self-education, but at the most visible accumulation of new institutions or impressive changes to what has gone before. But in this case, the essentials can remain completely the same. All this must run its course. The spectators must wither away from their own boredom. In the meantime, the vitality is gathering for the new grounding of the German university. When it will come and by what means, we do not know. The only thing that is certain is that we must prepare for what is to come on our part. We must not wear ourselves out on the continuation of what has gone before. We cannot allow our secret view of what is to come to be distorted. Nor will we ever stand aside with the right will and ability sets to work when the right will and ability sets to work. We will remain in the front of the Das Geheimen Geistigen Deutschland, the secret spiritual Germany. Heidegger later would, of course, begin lecturing on Hölderlin for the first time only a few months later. His turn to Hölderlin, though, was not in itself a turn to language, which had occupied Heidegger's mind for some time. In his 1925 lectures on Plato's Sophists, he points out that there does indeed exist the task of conceiving logic once and for all, much more radically than the Greeks succeeded in doing, and of working out thereby, in the same way, a more radical understanding of language itself, and consequently also of the science of language. His engagement with the philologists undoubtedly facilitated his plans to produce a more radical understanding of language. One such classicist was Julius Stenzel, who Heidegger formed a close friendship with until his untimely death in 1935. Stenzel was himself a strong proponent of the integration of ancient Greek values and ideals into German culture and education, which characterized classical philology at this time. In Stenzel's final work of 1934, Philosophie der Sprache, in which Heidegger is twice mentioned, he says that the renewal of a nation can only occur through participation in and caretaking of the modern tongue. If the absolute oneness of the logos is to be retrieved, it must be reborn in the body of the language. Werner Jaeger likewise maintained a friendly relationship with Heidegger and spoke of rediscovering the original meaning of logos for his third humanism. Jaeger, in an interpretation of Isocrates, characterized Greek logos as the creatix of culture in human society, whereby logos has the potential to create strong ties among members of a society and common valuations within the polis. Isocrates showed Jaeger that rhetoric can go beyond the purely formal technique of hypnotizing the ignorant masses with persuasive talk, which Jaeger had observed in Plato's Gorgias. He says, for logos means speech, in the sense of rational speech and communication, which always rests upon the acknowledgement of common values. It was frequently discussed in last year's reading of Einführung in die Metaphysik, and especially in the year before the reading of the Heraclitus lectures, that Heidegger's understanding of logos changed quite radically between 1928 and 1944. That is, when he abandoned trying to figure out the differential of the ontological difference after his lectures on Die Grundprobleme der Phänomenologie to the end of his 1943-44 lectures on Heraclitus. The problem of logos as the ground of language, as the ground of logic, pervaded Heidegger's thinking throughout the 1920s. But the issue became more significant by 1931, when in a letter to Igor Vieta, he asserted that his issue was not logic per se, but rather the ratio underlying logic that had long been groundless. Like his contemporary philologists, Heidegger concluded that it is a matter precisely of understanding in an original way the concealed rule, verborgene Volten, of the ancient Greek logos and setting it to work. Heidegger's turn to Hölderlin in 1934, then, was also a turn to Heraclitus. As he says in these very lectures in GA39, Hölderlin's entire thinking and understanding of being, das Sein, was subject to the power of Heraclitus, and remained so from his student years in Tübingen to the years of his greatest creativity and well beyond. For Heidegger, both Hölderlin and Heraclitus represented the possibility of understanding and setting to work the concealed rule of the ancient Greek logos. As I said at the start of this introduction, and I'm just wrapping up now, Hölderlin for Heidegger was not behind the Germans. He did not exist in the historical past of Germany, but rather he was already ahead of them, a fate that must be seized and can only be seized by asking the fundamental question, wer sind wir? Who are we? In some sense, the timing of Heidegger's engagement with Hölderlin must have been precipitated by Bäumler's own appropriation of the poet. Heidegger must have felt an urge to liberate Hölderlin not just from Bäumler, but from the ceaseless popularization of his works. Where Bäumler aimed to develop a philosophy of language grounded in the hidden meaning of symbols, Heidegger's task was to emancipate language from the groundlessness of logic itself in order to let it speak. Who are we? Heidegger asks. We are, Hölderlin says, ein Gespräch, a conversation. Thank you.